So, welcome to this session on project identifiers, enabling FAIR with project identification and metadata. So this is a birds of a feather session, which means that we have sort of a short-ish time for scene setting type presentations, and then quite a long time for discussion, ideas, questions around all things related to project IDs. So very happy to see such a full house actually, and welcome. So first of all, you have heard this acknowledgement in the main room, but I would like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. In Brisbane, I pay my respects to the Turrbal and Yagara peoples of Brisbane, which is the place where I live, work and play. So welcome first to new RDA members. Do we have any new RDA members? Sort of ish, a few, been hanging around the edges, now I'm here. Fantastic, welcome, and welcome to everyone who's travelled probably quite a long way to get here. I'm sure there's a fair few people here feeling a bit of jet lag, and we hope that you won't fall asleep during the session. And one thing to note about the microphone is we will have a roving microphone because there are people joining us online. So welcome everyone who is joining us online today. So if you have a question or you want to make a comment, we will pass you the microphone so that people who are online can actually hear that. Okay, so my name's Natasha Simons. I'm the Director of National Coordination at the Australian Research Data Commons, and within my portfolio is project identifiers, specifically and persistent identifiers in general. So the ARDC has been leading the development of the National PID strategy in Australia, and one of those missing pieces in the past has been project identifiers, and specifically we have the development of RAID, the Research Activity Identifier, which is an ISO standard for project identification. And that was actually mentioned by the Chief Scientist this morning, which was a wonderful little shout out to the need for project identifiers. However, it isn't the only project identifier, and that's why we're here today to explore that concept. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to just put out some scene setting questions, and then we are going to explore some use cases from my colleagues. And just to mention that this original proposal, I had some collaborators in this proposal who unfortunately weren't able to attend International Data Week, and so others have stepped in, which is wonderful, and I'll let them introduce themselves when they present their case studies. Okay, so why are we having this birds of a feather session? Well, there are actually no RDA groups to my knowledge that specifically look at project identifiers, either as an interest group or as a working group. So there are broader PID groups like the PID Interest Group or the National PID Strategies Interest Group, and in the PIDs for Instruments is another one of something looking at quite a specific challenge. Project IDs are also a really specific challenge and have been a missing piece in that research landscape and in that PID graph, so that you're able to link researchers with data, with activities, with grants, with projects, things like that. Projects has been one of the missing pieces. Okay, so projects serve as hubs that link researchers, organisations, outputs and funding, but standardised approaches to identifying and documenting these actually varies quite greatly, and that creates that significant gap in the research information landscape. And project identification is relatively new. As I mentioned, there's a new RAID ISO standard that was released in 2022. And an internationally agreed metadata standard for describing projects is not yet developed, and even the term project is open to interpretation. So I just want to clarify here that when we're talking about projects, we are talking about the activities undertaken. So it's different from a grant. So if you think about that, a grant is something you get, and a project is something you do. So grant metadata, for example, has a really fixed amount of information that happens. You get the grant, you have a certain amount of money, a funding organisation, chief investigators. but then the researchers go away and they do the project. And when you do a project, just much like taking a shopping list to a shop, you end up with something different to what you originally planned. And so you want to be able to track the activities that happen during the course of a project and link them under a single persistent identifier. Okay, so project information is fragmented across a number of systems, so institutional systems, funded databases, repositories, and there's a lot of inconsistent practices about managing projects. And in fact, it's quite dark information and often held very closely by a researcher and hard to sort of unearth. And so there are different approaches to identifying projects, but there's no real consensus on what the best practice is. And there may be different types of project identifiers for different purposes. For example, there's a GitHub project identifier, which is different from a RAID. There's a data site project ID, which is also different from a RAID or different from that GitHub project ID. Okay, so some scene setting questions for you to think about that might help seed our discussion is, what are project identifiers, and what's the difference between projects, grants, awards? Why do we need these things? What's a project anyway? For example, a project in a library might be moving a set of data from one repository to another. We're actually talking here about large research projects in general, but the term's quite open to interpretation. And how do they fit with other PIDs, and why are there different project identifiers, and does that matter? So last slide I had, and we can come back to this at the end, is, if there is interest in the RDA community in exploring this further, what kind of things might we address within the global community? So we could look at collecting some use cases around this, developing guidance, for example, when one project ID is suitable and another more so than another one, or what they're all about. We could be promoting the uptake of project identifiers as a global community and taking that back to our organisations. We could map the workflows of project identifiers, and it could complement the work of other RDA groups that I've mentioned, like the National Bid Strategies Interest Group, and any other ideas you have. But that will depend on you here today and what you want to do. Gosh, I'm getting a bit of feedback there. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, so move on to use cases. I will first hand over to my colleague, Matthias Liffers.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm jet lagged as well. Yes, sorry. I like to wander when I present, and I will have to avoid that tendency. Good morning, everyone. I am a little jet lagged. I've come from Perth, Western Australia. There's a 2-hour time difference and 3,000 kilometres. And I had a room that was not air conditioned last night. So, I then moved rooms at 2 a.m., but that still disrupted my sleep a fair bit. So I'll try and be as coherent as possible. Before I get into talking about use cases using RAID, the Research Activity Identifier, I'd like to pay my respects to the Turrbal and Yagara people, the elders past, present and emerging who keep their language, culture and traditions alive. As I said, I'm from 3,000 kilometres away on the lands of Whadjuk Noongar people. I live, play and work there. And at the moment, we're just coming into the season of Kambarang. Kambarang is the time of year where flowers, the wildflowers, come out. And I'm lucky enough to live on a street with native peppermint trees known as wannel, and they are just starting to show their white flowers, and they are one of the key indicators of Kambarang. So my favourite time of year, to be honest, because I like taking photos of flowers. RAID in particular, Natasha has mentioned it a few times already, but for those who are unfamiliar with RAID, in a nutshell, it's a global system governed by an ISO standard that Natasha mentioned, and there's the number for you, to uniquely identify research projects, collaboratively collect and publicly share information about them. Now, you'll notice that I emphasised research projects, and, well, Natasha covered this point as well. What is a research project? It's not a grant. A grant is a bundle of resources that you use to do a project. I like to think about a grant as not necessarily just money, It could be allocation of time and resources on a high-performance computer, or allocation of time for a human to do some things, because humans have the expertise on how to use instruments as well. However, in RAID, the broad definition that we use is that a research project is a time-bound activity that generates new knowledge. Time-bound is quite important. A project has a start date, and it will probably finish one day. There are a few projects that are intended to take a very long time. I mean, perhaps building a cathedral. I mean, that's a couple of decades long. But building a cathedral is not necessarily a research project. However, the generating new knowledge part is that key part of research. So in building a cathedral, the primary purpose is to build a place of worship. The primary purpose is not necessarily to generate new knowledge. And so we try to fix that scope of RAID so that it doesn't necessarily try to take over the world. I mean, we'd love to take over the world, of course, but we want to work well with other identifiers for other things. Natasha mentioned a GitHub project identifier. GitHub is a platform for collaboratively working on software projects and other projects these days as well. And so perhaps a GitHub identifier might be a more appropriate identifier for a software development project that has nothing to do with research. Now, the specific use case I'd like to highlight here is one that's happening in Australia at the moment. We have the Australian National Environmental Science Program. It's already been, in fact, I'll show you on the next slide, it's already been running for a few years, and it is governed by our federal government Department of Climate Change, Environment, Energy and Water. Now, I might have gotten some of those words out of order, but DEQ is the acronym, so I'll mention DEQ a few times. So DEQ has, in this NESP program, or National Environmental Science Program, they distribute money to a number of hubs around the country. And these hubs are hosted within research institutions, universities, or other departments that conduct research. And those hubs then allocate the funding further to projects that take place all over the country. So even though there are only 4 hubs at 4 host institutions, the projects themselves take place at any number of institutions, dozens. And so there is a model of activity there. We have at the very highest level, NESP, and this is NESP Phase 2, which commenced in 2021 and will finish in 2027. And there is a separate RAID for NESP 1. Now, each of the hubs, we didn't necessarily think it was appropriate to try and get an organisational identifier for them because the hubs really are activities in and of themselves. So each hub also got a RAID. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not showing you a RAID for a hub, I'm going directly to a project. And so within the NESP Resilient Landscapes projects, there is a project about conservation and recovery actions for rare and threatened wet tropics freshwater fish. So that research is taking place a good 1,000 kilometres north of us in the wet tropics. And this project in and of itself has a start date and a projected end date. Now, how does this actually do anything? So it's all well and good to model your research project in RAID, but the idea is to achieve a business use or a research use. And so what we're still building, which is why I don't have anything to show you just yet, unfortunately, is a data portal that anybody can use to find all of the outputs of research from that particular program. And the idea is that DEQ can use this data portal, can use all the information collected by RAID to get an idea of what the researchers are actually creating without requiring the researchers to write regular update reports and things like that. And the idea is that the RAID for each of the project is included in repository metadata for the project outputs. And through ARDC's Research Data Australia product, we already harvest repository information, so we'll be keeping an eye out for that RAID and building a special domain data portal for DEQ. Now, other use cases of RAID, I think I duplicated a slide there accidentally. I'm not going to go into this because this is not my story to tell, but our partners in the US have very recently, actually it's been a month already, published a blog post where they've collected use cases from the US and possibly some Canadian stakeholders. So Sheila Rabin at Lyricus has written this excellent blog post, and I recommend that you look it up. If you Google Lyricus blog, you'll find the post. It might be a few posts down now. And I'm obliged to advertise the RAID community meeting that is taking place this coming Friday and Friday morning. Check the IDW associated events and you can register there. It's free to attend and a short walk in the Brisbane CBD. And I think with that, I'll hand straight over to Kyle and Giacomo. Yep.
Hi everyone, so I'm Giacomo Cannizzaro. I come from SURF, the national infrastructure provider for research and education in the Netherlands. I personally come from the research world, but I've been working on open science related themes for the last 2 years and a half, almost 3 years.
My name is Kyle Snyder. I'm also from SURF in the Netherlands, originally from the United States though, born in Alaska. So I try to use that to give something people to remind me remember me about. I'm a product manager and advisor within the data preservation services team at SURF, and together we are actually setting up RAID in Europe. So I wanted to just give a bit of background about what SURF does, because it actually will help us understand the use cases that we're going to share today. So we're a national infra provider in the Netherlands, and we have within our membership about 100 institutes. This includes universities, university medical centers, applied science colleges, research institutes, and vocational schools. And our main goal, of course, is to understand the open research information needs of our members, provide them services, but then also help the enablement and maturation of their RDM work with the services that we provide. But another channel of work that we have is aligning the Netherlands with the developments in the EU, usually through European Open Science Cloud projects. So I want to overview some use cases. So we have some use cases from applied sciences where they really wanted to improve their information maturity, and they were really looking to adopt a CRIS, and they came to SURF saying, hey, we want to use RAID as a CRIS. Is this maybe something that we can work on? And through our first engagements with them, we saw that although emotionally they're ready for a CRIS and they have these needs, they actually don't already start to document their research information. So this level of enablement actually needs to go a bit further back, so more start to document the information in a standardized way. Quite different though, we have a use case from a research institute called Naturalis, the bioinformatics institute. And they want to standardize information across multiple systems that they have, including even like computational pipelines. And really the picture that they're trying to paint is how can we get RAID to support a complete architecture and information support, where you have RAID having multiple touch points across their various pipelines, but also a new central information management system. So whereas like we might consider, oh, we can integrate our project identifier with one system, for them it was actually a system of systems. With the same intention, Freie University also wants to integrate RAID potentially into their CRIS system, but also a new information architecture. So what we're actually seeing is, although institutes really want to adopt project identifiers, they're still working a lot on their own information management, even on a cultural level within their institute. And what was interesting for us to learn while working with Naturalis is that they said that adopting RAID technically, like working with the service was very easy to onboard within their teams, and people were able to learn about the RAID service quite easily. But they actually, RAID acted as a catalyst for them to work on overall PID strategy in their organizations. So you actually see a bit of like cultural change there as well with some of these service adoptions. I'll hand off to Giacomo.
Yeah, and not only we had like actual practical use cases in which we worked with institutions, we also had several conversations around the Netherlands, and particularly with funders. We know that project identifiers are quite dear to funders because one of the best use cases is to track the funding information and how the research outputs correlates the funding, and so give transparency to the grants and the funds that are actually given out. We started a conversation with Health RI and ZonMV. These are two healthcare funders on a smaller scale. And our conversation started because they were interested in adopting a PID for their grants. But we quickly understood from, we started talking about RAID since we're onboarding the service in our company. We found quite a great interest for the idea of a project identifier and how to connect all these research outputs. But it also quickly hit a roadblock, which was more political in nature, because the small funders could not agree and align on the information model and on what kind of practical solution to adopt. So this was, I think, revealing for us right at the beginning of the RAID work we were doing. And then we also had a conversation with the NVO, which is the Dutch Research Council. It's the biggest scientific founders in the Netherlands. And in that conversation, we kind of like approached with a top-down solution in which we think that a funder can really increase and push for the adoption of a project identifier such as RAID in the research landscape. And we talked about maybe integrating. They were developing a new grant application platform, and we talked about possible points of integration in which these project identifier would start at the inception of a grant maybe. And so it actually also brought up the interesting question of when do a project start. But then we also understood a bit this political point, which is a project identifier is something that maybe everybody wants, but not a lot of people want to take responsibility for. And so what do we do with this? We don't know. And I think we can live with a bit of symptoms and questions that we don't necessarily have an answer to, that hopefully will foster a bit of discussions at the end of the session. Well, hopefully you took a picture, because it's time for Matt.
So I'm clearly not Matt Vice, nor have I ever been. Actually, I don't see Matt in the room, unfortunately, so I don't know. He is here at the conference. Yeah, but he's not here in the room. So channeling Matt a little bit is just a bit of background. Well, I'm on the DataCite executive board, so I can at least say a little bit about project IDs from the what DataCite are using them for. So there is a way that you can issue DOIs for your projects through the DataCite system. So anyone who's a DataCite member can mint project DOIs, and that is quite different to what you get from the RAID system. It is a sort of subset of the RAID metadata and doesn't have the same kind of functionality of being able to record and group all of the PIDs together in a dynamic way as the project unfolds. However, RAID is still not ubiquitously used, or it takes a while for it to become available for a particular community. So the project IDs are in use through the DOI system that DataCite are providing. And that's probably about all I can say, although there might be other people in the room who are using those who might want to share their experiences. Here he is, Matt. That's all right. Right. I've said your bit already, actually, Matt. I did say a bit about project IDs, but go. Yeah, no, you're right up now.
Yeah. So I don't know what Natasha said. I really apologize. It's the problem with IDW. There's so many people in our community here. really just to maybe just touch on the fact that, so data sites, obviously, our vision is connecting research, advancing knowledge, and the idea there is that we cover a range of resource types across a number of outputs and resources, over 30, and the focus there is bringing the disparate pieces of the research lifecycle together. And so as part of that, we have built various technologies, APIs, interfaces that really bring together these different pieces, so we can address some of these downstream use cases and understanding the different pieces of the research lifecycle and how they interact with each other. And so with that, we've built out project identifiers, which I'm sure Natasha mentioned is the baseline, the underlying kind of infrastructure, as I would put it, to what RAID builds out as a system that is purpose-built and purpose-led for projects. And so in this way, we have a really nice collaboration and work with RAID in being able to address some of the fundamental use cases in baseline metadata through relations and connections, and then RAID building on top of that, addressing more specific system use cases with specific landing pages and advanced technology to support that further. And so that's, I guess, the data side perspective. We see a future in working very closely with RAID and continuing our collaboration and working with the community on this. And I apologize for being late, and hopefully it all linked together. Yeah.
That's good, thanks. Well done, thank you, Matt. Okay, so now we are on to the discussion part of this. So first of all, does anyone want to kick off with questions, points of clarification, use cases, or anything else that they want to add to what's been said so far? I mean, there's a lot of people in this room. What brought you here? What kind of problems can project IDs solve for you? And how are you approaching that?
Just getting us started.
Could you introduce yourself to Lee,
sure,
please?
absolutely.
Yeah,
Lee Wilson, Digital Research Alliance of Canada. So we're a national a digital research infrastructure provider in Canada. We're quite interested in becoming a registration agency or authority for RAID in that region. We already work with partners across the country on our national PID strategy and provisioning other PID services like DOIs and ORCID IDs, or supporting those different PIDs. So very interested in RAID. I think we're really interested in what the various use cases could be. We're at the very beginnings of starting to launch a project around this, and some of the things that have come up almost immediately are were alluded to in the different presentations, which is many organizations see the value of RAID in particular or project identifiers, but the question of who has responsibility for these over time. So who actually mints these, who are the service provider points within the RAID system, and then who maintains those registrations over time, I think are some of the biggest questions. So more questions than answers at this point, but we would just be very curious to hear others' perspectives in the room on those.
Fantastic, thanks, Lee. There was someone else with their hand up before. Yes.
Similar question about this. Bernadette Highland Wood, and I've worked on topics around persistent identifiers, starting with OCLC in the United States, and contributed to the open source project for Pearls, which is still running as an essential service to the US government, despite the fact that we're not getting paid, but that's okay. So my question is the same in terms of if persistence is really important, and then who are the maintainers? Because literally the US government has 40 digital librarians who literally call up US EPA and USDA, et cetera, and say, where has that document or that data set gone? And that's, well, politically very fraught. When an administration comes in and wants to defund things or kill those information resources because they don't support open science. So could you delve into that a little?
Yeah, probably. Did you want to talk about, well, actually, are you on that topic, Dan? Or yeah, okay. Did you want to talk a bit about permissions in RAID and how we've sort of tackled that?
Yeah, well, we one of my most favourite things to say to people when they tell me, ask me, how do I use RAID? What should I do? The first question I ask is, what's your business case? What do you want to achieve? Because I don't know if I'll get fired for this. A PID for a PID's sake is not a good idea. A PID is a tool to achieve a purpose. And so every RAID that is created comes with an overhead for maintenance, like with any other PID. But a RAID possibly even more so, because a project changes over time. And so over the course of building the cathedral, you ideally are committed to maintaining the RAID, adding the new additions to that, which is a bit trickier than something like a DOI for a publication, because hopefully when a publication is published, it doesn't change, it doesn't get retracted or updated, hopefully. And so there's not as much of a need for the PID itself to remain updated, although it might be that the PDF of the publication vanishes for some reason. So the RAID system itself does allow, at the moment there's a degree of flexibility. However, typically the RAIDs will belong to an organisation of some kind, and it's up to that organisation to maintain their own RAIDs. But a friend of mine in government likes to talk about the semantic violence that exists, especially here in Australia, when we have a change of government. Government departments get chopped and changed and moved around. I don't know how common that is in other countries, but I feel like it's a really big problem here in Australia. And so RAID is a technical solution, and we can't necessarily dictate the governance side of things. It's up to organisations to decide that for itself. I'm not sure we can solve the problem for organisations, but we would like to make the access model into the RAID system a bit more flexible and provide access to RAIDs at the very granular level where project members can access just one particular RAID and keep that up to date. And we're not necessarily relying on an entire organisation to do that for them.
I just wanted to also add a piece that there are some dynamic elements to the metadata, and very correctly, as you said, like the PID for the sake of PID is not worth it. It's the utility that comes out of the metadata. One of the key pieces of project identifiers and RAIDs that is the relational metadata, and that changes constantly, even with research outputs, data sets, and that is bidirectional. We can pull out of, okay, there's a citation in a paper, these links, and we'll put those into the record. So we do that actively and work with RAID and expose those. And the RAID model is really good in the ability for multiple individuals to have permissions to update that. And so there's not this single authority that you stack on. Also from a system contractual perspective, if I look at the relationship between DataCite and RAID, there's the ability to transfer that between different RAID RAs, I think they're called. Transferring those responsibilities over and being able to maintain that provenance and persistence over time is really important.
Thanks, Matt. So Kevin Ashley, Digital Curation Centre. I think you partly answered perhaps, but one part of the question I was going to ask is that which is about the transfer of responsibility, because I think it's a general problem with PIDs, isn't it? That usually there's an assumption that an organisation mints a PID, and at that same point, you're making this declaration that I will ensure this thing has permanence. And as you said, not necessarily the endpoint, but the PID itself will continue to be active. And there are many sorts of use cases. This is one of them where I think organizations that would like to use identifiers nonetheless would be reluctant to make that long-term commitment unless there was some way of transferring responsibility. So it sounds as if that does exist. I think that's certainly, I think one of the other interesting points to make, I mean, a number of you made the point earlier on that grants and projects aren't the same thing, and I think that's certainly important. I know in many organizational contexts, there are often projects that aren't associated with grants, and it's just as important to be able to have the identifiers for them as anything else. But it does tie together that issue then of when, I don't know, when do you generate the identifiers, or I can imagine that it is likely that in different contexts there will be many different identifiers for an individual project. Well, and I don't understand about how you tie those together. So certainly, I can imagine, let's say the workflow in my institution where a project will get an internal identifier before anyone else knows about it. When we start thinking about, we're going to work up a proposal to do something, whether or not it involves external funding or something else, and we've got an administration system which will assign an identifier to that. And if at some point we go and submit that to some external funder, if the thing gets funded, then the funder will assign some identifier to it. And ideally, what we want to be able to do is, you want to tie all those things together. You want to have some means to, and I presume RAIDs in some way can help us do that, resolve that issue of this thing over there is talking about the same thing roughly as this thing over here.
Yes, so RAID has a metadata schema that is at the same time simple but also quite complex, in that RAID itself tries to avoid storing redundant information. So we don't store a human's name, we store their ORCID and rely on ORCID to let us know what that human's name is at any given point in time, because human names can change. RAID can also assert relationships between RAIDs, between projects, and RAID metadata also lets you assert a relationship to like an untyped identifier. So an internal ID number that was generated by a CRIS system, for example. On the topic of the ownership and the governance, well, the ownership of a set of PIDs, I mean, I have experience in this. I've worked with I used to coordinate the data site consortium here in Australia, and I worked with quite a few organisations who wanted to move PIDs between them. But I mean, the technical infrastructure is there. It's quite straightforward to move a DOI between data site repositories organisations. The hard bit is the governance level. It is the permissions. Who at this organisation is authorised to say, we want to give those DOIs to that organisation? And right now, I don't know if any of our colleagues from South Australia are here, we've got 2 universities merging, which is going to be a whole lot of fun. Although I think merging might be easier than splitting a university in 2 and then going through each identifier one by one to decide which one goes where. But that's still going to be a whole lot of fun for Siobhan, who gets to look after that. Have I answered or spoken to your points? Okay, because... Yep. And for those streaming online, I have been looking at the questions online. I haven't seen any come through yet. So maybe if somebody online could post a question so I know the system is working, that would be great.
Hi, I'm Dan Katz from University of Illinois in the U.S. I spent a couple of days at the end of last week at a workshop that was looking at OpenAlex and software. And one of the challenges that came up there is that we realized that we didn't have a unified definition for what a item of software was, and that was actually a big problem. And so I guess I'm curious, kind of on one hand, how this project can keep going without actually defining what a project is, and kind of when that needs to happen, and if there's just some implicit agreement that everybody has and they just haven't actually written it down yet, or something. And then similarly, just on the last comment that Matthias was just making, it also seems like it would be useful if there was some kind of maybe a project life cycle that talked about how a project started, how it ended, where an identifier gets assigned, if projects come from other projects, if they come from nothing, if they join other projects and become a new project. So anyhow, so it seemed like there were a bunch of questions related to what is a project and how does an identifier actually map to it and when.
All of those things. I might actually, I was going to say, I hand to Siobhan, who was part of creating the RAID ISO standard, because that was surely a topic of intense conversation.
Hi. So harking back even before RAID came into existence, it was part of a project called the Research Data Lifecycle Project. And we looked at things like workflows and where things are done. And what we realised is there's no simple way and there's no one size fits all solution, which is a really lazy way of saying we can't dictate. And when you can't dictate, what you need to rely on is agreement amongst the research community and different disciplines and intersectionality there about what a project can be and when you assign identifiers to it. So the definition that RAID has, which is a time-bound activity that results in new knowledge, is probably as tight as I think we need currently for that definition to be. It would be lovely for it to be tighter. I write ISO standards. I love tight definitions, but I can't have one, and I'm really sad about it. But at the moment, it's that pragmatic kind of stage where we say, it's kind of this. We've got agreement in different disciplines as to when IDs need to be minted, and agreements from different organisation as to when IDs need to be minted. But that's also a discussion that's happening with platform providers, I call them, or vendors for different systems. And we can't dictate that without those vendors having a voice in that conversation. And I think that's where we're going at the moment, talking to different vendors and people making those systems, like my colleagues in SURF, as to where, is there a universality about where that point of minting should be. So Dan, the answer is, I'm really sorry we don't have an answer. And I hope that these guys can come up with one, because it's not my job anymore.
But yeah.
Hi there, Chris Seal from the University of Auckland. I think if I can add a comment to when you would mint one of these identifiers, comes back to the question Matthias asked at the start. What is your business case? What is the use for it? Because with different uses, there'll be different points in that research life cycle where it would be appropriate for you to mint that ID.
I have a question about a lot of excellent consensus-oriented, community-built infrastructure has evolved over the last 25, 30 years, arguably, of the web, 25 years. And a lot of it, and I say this because I'm older, has been co-opted by a small number of highly funded venture capital firms, venture-funded firms in the United States and in China. And so I have a question about, is any of this work, is there a potential for any of this work to get co-opted or taken over by corporations? Are we adding infrastructure to make the job of crawling and training LLMs easier, which may not be a bad thing, but could be a bad thing, especially depending on what kinds of information, and thanks for clarifying that no PII is within these records. But I do genuinely ask that question now as somebody who was involved early in making it really easy to train a lot of these big LLMs. Easier.
I think Matt was quite keen on addressing this.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to make a point around, we've got the principles of open scholarly infrastructure, which call out some of these elements. I guess the short answer to your point is yes, it can be commercialized and certain stakeholders can do stuff with this. But the insurance that we provide to the community as open scholarly infrastructure that we should all agree on is that we don't sell data, we make data openly available, and we open source the code. And so with that, yes, stakeholders can do stuff with that, but we are not locked into them. They cannot co-opt a particular infrastructure. And I say that for data side, if we did something like stupid that no one liked, somebody could go and take our data, take our entire code, and that whole community could shift over to a new stakeholder and set up tomorrow if they wanted to. And I think that's these core principles that we should all aspire to avoid these type of scenarios. So yes, it can happen, but as long as we have these principles to address it, we should be okay.
Yeah, I think that was well said. I might also add, tiny point that RAID is also trademarked, so at least there's something in there. It doesn't stop, that kind of scenario, but there's something in that. Siobhan, did you want to say something to that?
But before that, RAID and DOIs are governed by ISO standards.
Yes.
And ISO is the ultimate authority. Yes, Siobhan, who, not joined the ARDC, wrote the ISO standard, the ARDC did a lot of work, but when it became time to appoint a registration authority, the ARDC had to apply for that. And it was a competitive process. It wasn't a foregone conclusion that it was us. And so now, should the ARDC stop being funded, which is entirely possible, our current funding is until mid-2028, then ISO can appoint a new registration authority. Our code is open, the data is open, another registration authority could be appointed, and life will go on without us. And DOI is in a similar state as well. Did you want to add to that, Siobhan? Okay, thank you.
With hand up.
Yep.
Hi, my name is Becky Grady from the California Digital Library, and I work on the DMP tool. And so I'm curious, my question comes from thinking about how a service like DMP tool and many other services like it would integrate with something like RAID. It's a very broad question, and I'm not even sure how to exact, but it's something that we know we want to support identifiers that are being used by the community. We are adding a project level hierarchy to the tool to contain multiple DMPs, and so that immediately makes me think about how we might connect to RAID or to project identifiers and DataCite, and what would that look like in your ideal world for something like a DMP service provider to connect to a RAID? Would it be something where it's just an ID that they put in their project? Is it something where we'd be sending metadata back to the DMP as listed in their RAID? How does that compare to linking to a DOI? Like we already linked to ORCIDs. That process is more clear to me. I'm not sure how that would work for a RAID and how that differs from a DataCite project ID to link to that.
Thank you, Becky. That's an excellent question. Is anybody from QSIF here? No, okay. Ooh, that's a chair. So QSIF, an organisation based here in Queensland, has a software product called Redbox, and one of its components is a data management planning tool. They have integrated RAID. And so the process of creating a DMP, which ideally happens at quite close to the beginning of a project, and is updated through the life of a project, that can trigger the creation of a RAID. So QSIF has integrated against the RAID API to do that process. Now, to me, I imagine that a DMP is an excellent place to trigger the creation of a RAID, because that can happen early in the project lifecycle. So whether DMP tool integrates with RAID and or DataCite to offer project identifiers that are not RAIDs to service the customers that can't access RAID at the moment, or even access other project identifiers. Is it a GitHub project identifier? Is it appropriate to pull that in from GitHub? And the DMP tool could, over the life cycle of the project, if the DMP is kept updated, then the DMP tool could contribute that metadata to any PID provider that it has already been hooked up to.
Can I just ask, colleagues at SURF, have you done any of that integration?
So we do have some projects in SURF working on DMP integration. And what I wanted to say earlier related to the topic is that we actually had discussions with NWO, the research funder in the Netherlands, specifically about when to trigger the creation of a RAID, like what point is possible. And it made me think, do we then adopt some type of principle or guideline, like early as possible, late as necessary, And I wonder, because NWO said it would be interesting for them actually to receive a RAID in a grant application process for them to be able to review the validity of the research proposal, including the methods, but then also all sources that are involved in that. And that they thought it would actually be an interesting tool to use to review proposals. So then, of course, like the DMP it goes hand in hand with this, I think.
Yeah, I mean, generally with PIDs, it's mint as early as possible in the process, right? But our funders as well, the Australian Research Council, we've had some discussions with them about desire to mint RAID with the grant approval, and then say right now you can track your project through the RAID so that they can track the funding over a long period of time, not just over that short reporting period that they currently have. So, but then it's a question of, well, would they then own the RAID? It would be best off transferred to an institution to manage it from there, but yeah. Sorry, there's a...
No,
Giacomo,
I was just wanting to add to the conversation about like what metadata exchange or like what kind of integration would look like. In the conversation we're having with the partners in the Netherlands, we do envision RAID to be a bit in the background of systems and not necessarily interacted directly with researchers and people, but we would like to see this as automatized as possible.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, and one more note, for anybody building a RAID integration, please pull from RAID as well as push to it. Don't just think that because you've pushed something to RAID, that is, or any other PID, I should say, don't assume that is still the current state the next time you try to change it. Andrea.
Hi, Andrea from DMP Online. The question that I have is, one of the challenges that we have on every single DMP platform is to keep the DMP updated. And I believe that even on RAID, because it's a project, how you engage or promote to keep this project updated, because I can mint a RAID, I have my identifier, and I can go on with my research and don't publish anything single output inside RAID. So it's just that I stick at the start, just at the end I have something completely different, but the container of this information is not updated. And this is something that we see, and there is a lot of talk about, oh, it's a living document. Yes, that is a dream, pretty much.
I think Kyle would like to speak to this.
Thanks. Yeah, maybe just only one part of that is it's really about like a bit of cultural and attitude shift with it, like that we don't really see RAID as being used, only at the end of a process, but really like it's facilitated along research collaboration. So one kind of like use case that we've been talking about is, can we get to a point where, if you go to a conference and you see an ORC ID, can we get to a conference where you see a RAID there as default for the project, and that when a team has a new collaborator, let's say a PhD student is hired in a project, immediately they're given RAID as the handover for the research project, because the RAID should have everything related to the project, the methods, the sources, software, environments also. That honestly, like if I was working at any organization, I would love to receive a RAID to show me where all the information was, because digging through information when I start a job is really hell. So yeah.
Just on the technology, obviously there's a social change in getting people to interact with it, but we're also trying to shift also on the technology. We're doing this for like data sets as an example. We're doing a big project with the data citation corpus, actually identifying data sets, even if they're not specifically cited, we can infer which data set that is, and we've just developed an algorithm through a Kaggle competition and just awarded those. If you go look at Kaggle, make data count, you'll see that winning algorithm. And we're doing the same across the board in that we can identify these relations and infer, okay, there's this project, and try identify that RAID. And we're getting better with these AI algorithms to detect that. So it could be explicitly cited, that's ideal, and it ends up in the metadata, then we know about it, and we can link it back into the RAID. We don't need the user to do anything. But we can also go and find these in papers, in reports, and pull that back, and also infer that into the record as well. So I guess it's not a perfect solution, but we're making a lot of progress on the technical infrastructure side to actually reduce burden on individuals having to actually go and manage these records constantly, because researchers don't want to do that. The same with ORCID. Like, they don't want to go and update their ORCID record the whole time. Should just all work.
Thanks for bringing up ORCID, Matt. I'll pass the mic to him in a moment. If we look at how long ORCID's been around, and when ORCID was first envisaged, people had to log in and update it themselves. They had to add their papers themselves. But now we're in a world where there's a lot of automation with ORCID, including with RAID. Add a researcher to RAID, and with their authorization, that project then appears on their ORCID record. And we have, being a relatively new PID, we have the advantage to learn from the older PIDs about what makes things easier to use. But the one thing that nobody's solved yet is how to make culture change instantaneous without assimilating people into the Borg collective. So I will now hand to Josh.
Thanks, Matthias. I'm Josh Brown with More Brains Cooperative. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Persistent Identifier Interest Group, and this is kind of an open question for the room, but it is that this is a bit of RDA admin, really. I see Adrian's in the room as well. One of the things we do in the PIDIG is we discuss kind of broader thematic issues around persistent identifiers. The discussion here around having something that dives into these issues, what I'm hearing in the room this morning is there are a lot of detailed open questions, discussions around the workflows, discussions around how to effect the culture change around this, discussions around how to create the kind of interconnections and interoperability that would enable automatic updates here, how this interacts with other services, work around governance of these things. These are detailed, thorny questions that I'm wondering if this is something that you would see as a future for an interest group under the RDA umbrella. It's one of the purposes of the conversation today is to kind of get a sense of if this is something there is a need for. And as somebody who works with an existing persistent identifier community here, we have things like PIDs at institutional level, other national PID strategies that really get into the weeds on difficult practical questions that would not really, we would not have space to discuss in the PIDIG. Is this something that folks in the room would like to see more of?
Yes. Sorry. Hi, Matt Jeffries. I'm work on Europe PMC at the European Bioinformatics Institute. Something I was kind of wondering about is, I don't know what capacity there is to integrate with kind of imperfect other artifacts there are. So, I mean, I'm thinking in the context of grants. Like, most grants don't have any persistent identifiers. There's very, very few of them have DOIs. So I don't know what capacity there is to integrate where you have kind of an entity that should have a PID but doesn't. I don't know if that's something that's part of RAID.
That's an excellent question. From the point of view of RAID, we are still quite adamant on good, established, long-term PIDs that belong to somebody, because a URL that works now there's a good chance it won't work even in 6 months, let alone in 10 years or 20 years. So we are open, though. We're open to looking at new things to add explicitly as permitted links, permitted identifiers for things, even if they're not necessarily PIDs. But we need to think very hard about it, because every change that we make is something we have to then support forever, unless we want to introduce breaking changes, which is not a fun thing to do.
But it's a good point. I mean, there is a slow move, I think, for funders to move towards grant identifiers, particularly DOIs, and you can now get grant or award DOIs through either the Crossref DOI agency or DataCite, and there are community groups which involve the funders in doing that. In Australia, I'm quite excited that there's been a breakthrough here because as part of our national PID strategy, we've been working with the Australian Research Council, and they have released their PID action plan. And one of the top things on their plan is to assign DOIs for their grants because they want to be able to track them and they want to be able to link them to a RAID and see what happens with the funding that they do. And that has sort of, I mean, I feel like I have been trying to convince them of this, since forever, and it is really quite astounding to see it on a roadmap and very exciting. And I think if it is a bit of a thin edge of the wedge thing where there is that movement towards the funders making change. But this is the analogy here. We're building the plane while we're flying it, so there's still some pieces that are coming in to make the engine hum.
Kevin Ashley again, DCC. I just started to really follow up on that point, and I guess urge us not to get too hung up on the permanence of everything. Because certainly, there are lots of cases where grants have identifiers. They're not going to be permanent because the funders don't wish to. Their own record-keeping practices means that they're not going to claim to keep information about things that happened 20, 30 years ago. But there's still useful things you can get done with those identifiers for a period of years. And in the main, we are trying to make sure that we can get useful things done. And I would hate us to get us into a situation where we choose not to do something because we're too attached to the notion of everything must be permanent. Because I'm not sure everything does need to be permanent. And whilst I can understand we don't want to produce something that in the end is going to break in some way, I'm sure there must be some way to have parts of this in which there are things like the RAIDs, which we are making declarations of permanence about, but which can interact with other information systems which are a bit more transient and still get useful work done in the meantime.
That's really well said, Kevin.
Hi, thanks everybody. My name is Christy Holmes. I'm from Northwestern University in the US, and I'm really grateful to be part of this conversation today. It's really been interesting and stimulating and great to think about it in the context of our work. I am not an expert in this particular topic, but I think that this is an area that certainly deserves attention, and so it's great to hear the ideas that people are talking about. I will say when the SURF group was talking, one of the things they mentioned was this idea about maturity and some of these different use cases. And so in the spirit of this, what could the RDA community address? I wanted to suggest a couple of things that would be helpful to welcome people into this conversation and begin to understand the relationship of things. The first would be like a glossary or a data dictionary, just to be able to define some of these concepts so that we're using a shared language. I love the idea of persona projects to understand the people and the roles that are necessary to make something like this work. And then I also like the idea of maybe considering a maturity model project. So just identifying what maturity looks like so that organizations can understand what's needed on technical as well as social aspects to make something work and how to continuously improve. So thanks.
Thank you. Kyle, did you want to answer that? Yep. And then back to John Aspler.
We indeed actually have thought about adopting a maturity model and coming up with this because maturity models exist already for data. So I think this could be a helpful tool. We haven't done it yet, but maybe this gives us some motivation to do that soon. And then what we've realized through many engagements with institutes about RAID adoption is that it really depends on who you are. Like it was said already, it was your business case, but you can say what's a business case for a university, but you also say what's a business case for a small team. And it really depends on who you're talking with, how they will use RAID, and at what point in the life cycle of a research project. So our idea now actually at SURF is not only to expedite the onboarding of RAID more like in communities, but to kind of try to create like a learning community. So researchers, we had like create like a researcher RAID adoption community, a data steward one, because the questions and the motivations for using RAID will differ, and we think using this kind of approach could help.
And just before I hand the microphone to John, speaking of capability maturity models, that's something we've been working on here in Australia as a part of our PID strategy, and it is in almost a state to release publicly. It's about the 5 priority PIDs identified in our PID strategy. It includes RAID, but also covers DOIs, IGSNs, RAWs, ORCIDs. So are you going to bring it up in the PID strategies IG meeting this afternoon? Yeah, okay. Unfortunately, our colleague Lyle, who did a lot of that work with stakeholders, is not here. But yeah, watch this space.
You just mentioned that was actually created by the institutions. The institutional community here volunteered and collectively wrote that maturity model over about a 6-month period. So it's quite a big piece of work. They're a bit frightened about letting it go because nothing's ever perfect, and you're always like, oh, maybe we should have changed that. But I think we're at the point where we're just going to release it, and there may be some updates later down the track. Yeah.
Thanks so much. John Aspler, Canadian Research Knowledge Network. I just want to jump back a couple topics to the sort of, that thorny question of, well, not everyone's registering grant IDs yet, and how do we get that into a RAID, and what other kind of IDs could we use in the meantime? I guess one of the things I love about the idea of RAID is that most of the other PIDs are very static, of course. You register a DOI and it's a static PID, and that's good. That's what it's for. And RAID kind of gets at the messy relationships that all the people involved have. A student wins a scholarship and then drops out of grad school 2 years later, and all of that can be captured inside a RAID in some way that wouldn't, other than maybe inside an ORCID, be reflected in the web of relationships among all of the different kinds of entities that are getting PIDs. So, I mean, even though we have these static PIDs and these dynamic PIDs like RAID, the way that we apply PIDs can also be quite dynamic. So, for example, in Canada, we have had our first major funder join Crossref to register grant IDs, and they registered 25,000 DOIs all at once, going back 5 years. So now we have 25,000 grant IDs. It's the second biggest registrant, the Fonds de Recherche de Québec, the FRQ. It's the second biggest registrant of grant IDs in the world now, and they just implemented this project, did the 5-year backlog. And so that kind of thing, even if we don't have a grant ID in a RAID when it's formed, it can be added later. These things are of course, dynamic. And of course, the later you adopt these things, the more you see the way they're connected. It's great that FRQ's done this now, and something like 95% of those DOIs are associated with a ROR, while most other grant IDs are not, because ROR only became part of that metadata schema like 6 months ago or something like that. So, we sort of sometimes get stuck over time, but I think being open to and willing to make sure that we're engaging over time with the way that we can still go back and do things and assign things to older things, I think that will really help us approach RAID effectively. But yeah, I mean, all of the other big thorny questions around like who is even taking the time to update this is still going to be a messy problem for a long time.
Hi, Christine Kirkpatrick here from the San Diego Supercomputer Center. I just wanted to introduce myself in case other people want to talk afterwards. We're the group working with Lyrasis for the US Registration Authority, and so be glad to talk to people about it. Short story is, a lot of us have worked with ARDC a long time, so no surprise, Natasha and Matthias are awesome to work with. I really recommend partnering with them. And I think one of the, no, I mean, you have to really be committed to doing this, and there are technical hurdles that you will have to overcome, and there are things from the community that you have to reconcile, so you want to do it with people who, you're aligned with common values and interests. So anyway, great shout out to them. One of the things that I hope we can contribute to this conversation is how to set up a registration authority service in a sustainable way, because aside from these other thorny issues you've all brought up, there's also the need to create something that can outlast one grant, right? And so we have the money from the National Science Foundation to kickstart it and to pay for the time, and we think we have a good model for making that work, which is the short story is working with Lyrasis, which in the US is a consortium that already does this for some of the other big players, including ORCID and DataCite. So anyway, glad to be here. Thanks for hosting this, Natasha.
Thanks, Christine, and I'm sorry for not explicitly mentioning the San Diego Supercomputing Center when I pulled this slide up.
I actually can also share some stories on Surf's journey to making RAID financially sustainable. So when we started the engagement, it was through a European open science cloud project, Faircore for EOSC, where we collaborate with ARDC. And we used that funding as a way to set up the infrastructure at Surf and kind of get everything in order. And in the meantime, we were working with our membership community to see which of the sectors could take value from RAID. So over the course of many years of lobbying, what we found was really helpful for us is really tie the value of RAID to like an ecosystem of adoption. So it's not just one institute that has the money gets RAID. It's that all institutes, if we all participate together, and this is kind of Surf's approach, is a community-based approach. If we get all institutes together, everyone can contribute a small fee, and everyone benefits. Because in the end, this open research information is only valuable if we all contribute to it. So this is the way that we've been able to do it at Surf, and it seems like it's easier for us to just tell an institute, RAID actually is available for you now, instead of go through the contract hurdles and everything like this. So of course it takes more time to get that alignment at this network level, but I think long term we hope it's more resilient.
I actually wanted to make another comment going back to the grant ID discussion, because one of the conversations we had with these smaller healthcare funders, and what came out of that is actually that they are grant IDs, let's call them like that, they are unique, just not globally. So adding them somehow in the RAID metadata record is not a difficult thing because they maintain some kind of PID characteristic. And on top of that, as Surf, we offer a handle service. And with the handle service, with a unique prefix, you can actually just set the suffix as the internal ID. And so transforming these in actual PIDs could be a very simple thing and should not be a roadblock for the adoption of RAID, or such a big roadblock. It is a roadblock, of course.
Yeah, well, sorry, sometimes I like to talk about co-opting identifiers and turning them into PIDs, but yeah, that's a nice approach.
Yeah, and I guess I just wanted to add on that is that when you can do that, but also the metadata is really important because it's not just the resolution to the place. You want to be able to resolve and a machine to be able to get the metadata, and obviously in a handle structure you can do that and put it in the handle record. So just making sure that's part of it. The other comment, just while I've got the mic, is that I know what John was meaning around static identifiers, but I wanted to just contextualize that a persistent identifier should never be static, in the sense that yes, there's register metadata, but there's elements of that should continuously update, and we do that across data site records constantly. Millions of DOIs are being updated every week at data site, and that's what we would like to continue seeing. And it's not necessarily just by the registrant of that, and we're moving to a model of community stewardship around metadata and different elements of a metadata record to actually, as a community, keep that up to date and useful for the community.
Thanks, Matt. I think Lee, you wanted to say something.
Thank you. Yeah, so I just want to kind of get back to some of the questions posed above, and specifically, what could the RDA community address? It's sounding, to me anyway, like from all the open questions remaining, that moving from a BOF to something like an interest group does make a lot of sense. I can think of a few kind of key sort of subgroups or task forces that could come about. I mean, I think business models and financial sustainability around RAIDs is a topic that would really benefit from community discussion, as well as service models and workflows, and really getting at that who mints and when kinds of questions would be really valuable. And the session today, just seeing the different examples I wanted to hear more about every single example I heard about, so I'll definitely be bothering people after this session. But having a sustained community where we can have these kinds of conversations and really start to map out and track all of these different use cases and get towards some level of shared understanding or standardization on these kind of big questions would be really valuable.
And it's something about coming together as a global community. It was what was said in the keynote is that, you know, we're all asking really similar questions, trying to solve similar problems. So having it under the RDA banner, I think, is fantastic. May I just get a show of hands of who might be interested in being part of an interest group? To be a member of an interest group, you can basically just click join and lurk in the background. You do not have to contribute anything at all. But would anybody be interested in that? Let's get a few show of hands there. Fantastic. That is really great because I think as well I've been involved in a lot of discussions around RAID, and there's just rapid fire Q&A. There's just a lot of questions and there's still a lot of things that, you know, we actually need to answer as a community. It's not just about RAID as a technology and a system, it's actually about those fundamental questions that we need to answer together. So yeah, it was great. Who was someone else wanting to talk? Yes. We have time.
Still got a good 12 minutes.
If we have time, and I mean this very genuinely, I did research on communities of practice. I'm a huge believer in them, but the research revealed in Aotearoa, New Zealand and Australia that it's through beneficent managers that allow us to have time. If you work for a government organization or an academic institution, it's kind of not within, in academia, teaching, learning, and research per se. So how have some people, what are the experiences some people have about kind of getting buy-in, getting a little recognition, getting a little support internally for doing this work? Because we all feel obviously it's important or we wouldn't be here, but I'm wondering what strategies people have employed to get 2 hours or 4 hours every fortnight to participate in these calls and write things up and get them, they're incredibly important, especially as we see open science eroded by certain heads of major superpowers. Yeah, so I mean, what works? How do you get buy-in for this?
I put Josh on the spot from both of that.
I'm not sure what you were expecting me to say, Matt. I used to do a lot of partnerships work for Orchid, and it was a lot of volunteers internationally, and it was that network. One of the things is that recognition for the institution. There's something around, one of the things that encourages managers to be a bit beneficent is the fact that they get to kind of get some of the reflected glory of their employees' work. And they are seen as pushing the interests of their institutions as well. That was a really effective tool in getting people permission to come to things. One of the other things that we did a lot of, as well as recognising the work of the individuals, was also to kind of try and get that scale of a community of practice. So when people cycled in and out of roles, you had enough of a hive mind in that community as well. So there's a sustainability aspect to this, which actually something like the RDA helps to address some of that risk as well in a kind of a ad hoc collaboration like that.
Chris had his hand up. Chris.
Yeah, thank you. In answer to your question, so I'm a member of Centre for Research. We're a cross-university resource. We bid for 2 pots of money for projects that we ran internally. The first of those was to assess our research data maturity, and based on that, there was some recommendations that we made to the senior leadership. We also then had a second project specifically around PIDs, where we went and surveyed individual researchers and we asked them about what their pain points were, particularly in the administrative side of things, and tried to identify how PIDs might be appropriate to addressing some of those pain points. And again, we drafted a report at the end of that project and submitted that. The combination of those two, I think, helped bring our senior leadership along so that they understood the necessity of these and then that naturally flowed on to having a little more capacity.
Was there someone else first? No, cool. So I mean, obviously everything that's happening for us is very specific and contextual, so it's sort of hard to build out the same model, but I guess the biggest take home for us is for a long time the PID program was just the ORCID program, and it was funded by the community. So we have, I work at CRKN, which is an organization very similar to Lyrasis in focus and structure. Our library members, who CRKN negotiates with the for-profit publishers on behalf of libraries to access content, we just built out the ORCID consortium through that membership. And so when things fall apart, at least we have 40, 50 institutions that are funding a small part of it. Nowadays, we're funded centrally by the Alliance, which is Lee Wilson's organization, and that supports the program in its entirety. But if it were to fall apart, again, we would turn back to the membership. And really what it takes is, I think, dedicated FTE. My job is 100% PIDs. That's all I do. So I have the time and focus to do this. I manage the PID program in Canada, but at the same time, our institutions are seeing the value of this and starting to focus on it as well. So there are 2 libraries, academic libraries in Quebec, for example, that have a dedicated PID librarian role that has recently emerged. And I don't know if this will come from library space overall or just research data management space, but as the value and focus on PIDs grows, I think we are starting to see these roles emerge that enable that kind of PID leadership. So the way that it emerged in Canada is very specific to how Canada works, but I think ensuring that there is dedicated staff. We work like Lyrasis, we work with Lyrasis, so the folks there like Sheila Rabin, that's her role is very similar to mine, and it grew in a very similar kind of way. So I see that as a successful model, and I don't know what that would necessarily look like into the future, but it's worked for us.
Yep.
Just to respond to the questions, so there's a bit of a chicken egg thing when you're trying to justify your time. But what we've seen on some other projects, especially in the biomedical sciences, is that you can pull in people to the PID world if you show them the impact assessment work. And so if you can somehow find enough time to cobble something together that would be a proof of concept or show someone else's analysis that if you gave me this time, I could get you this, or if we started adopting these, you might be able to answer these questions. I've seen that be successful, and especially with pulling in program officers, which can control funding. They really have a hard time telling new stories about what they've done with the money they've given and love this stuff.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think I appreciate Josh's comment about the idea of the influence. I mean, I think you can certainly make the argument that this is that there's value in the service, but it is the outcome. It is the point of it all. Why are we using PIDs? We're using PIDs because they connect things. They help us create that graph. Why do we want to do that? It helps the assets that are produced by the university or the organization be discoverable, all of that. And so, I'm a really good example of making the case, because right now my university is completely frozen for federal funding. I'm here because my organization sees value in me being here and getting to learn from all of you. So, I think it can be done, but it's about being very direct about that.
Okay, we are getting close to time. Okay.
I just want to say 40 digital librarians that support the U.S. federal government are all, hopefully they're furloughed and they'll get back pay. But they're the original core group of people that put together and support the 1,200-member Federal Depository Library Program, which in theory preserves all documents deemed essential to American democracy. So we have a long lineage, all the people in this room, of people who came before them, and they're not getting paid right now, and yeah. So, yeah, I'm just saying how important the work is, how important the work is that the people in this room are doing, and that don't take it for granted, because it can go away.
So I'm lucky enough to help facilitate some communities of practice, and one in particular is the Identifiers for Instruments group in Australasia. Some of the folks are here. And that group has been a bit of a powerhouse because we've built connections with other communities of practice. So anyone who's running a community of practice, I think it's vital that we connect up with other communities of practice and that those have actual outputs, because they can be talk shops, and we do need talk therapy because it's a hard time for us right now. But to be able to provide a conduit for those great ideas and experiences to make, we put out a best practices for Australasia that we were able to then share with the international community, which then helped create the session that's on Wednesday about facilities. If anyone's around, please come and talk about facilities with us. So that way our little ideas become large ideas and our large ideas filter back into local community. Absolutely vital.
Great sympathy for our colleagues in the US going through really hard times right now. We're going to take one more comment or question, I'm not sure which, and then I think we're standing between you and lunch, so yeah.
I'll be quick, thanks. Alexandra, University of Belgrade. I'm currently thinking about who do we believe benefits from project PIDs, and you said that we should not force it for someone to have one. But I can see how researchers and research organizations and funders benefit from it. But if we see it also as a public good, sort of, and everyone benefits from it, then some groups will be excluded from this universe of project PIDs. For example, research projects are not only done by researchers at universities, but are also done by citizen groups, some NGOs, different NGOs, and they probably wouldn't have interest in having PIDs, project PIDs, or even funds for it. So ultimately, we wouldn't have any record or access to this. So maybe a question, I guess.
Thank you. No, look, I'm a citizen scientist. I take photos of beautiful things in nature and upload them to iNaturalist. I recommend you do so as well, because iNaturalist can tell you what that bug was. So I think that's about it.
We've got a lot of bugs in Australia. We really need to know what bites you.
Most harmless. Most.
No, I don't need that. But thank you, Matthias, and thank you, Kyle, Giacomo, and Matt, for your use case presentations. It was really fantastic. And thank you to everyone for coming and sharing all of your questions, ideas, thoughts, suggestions. I think it's been a really fantastic discussion, and I would like to see it continue as an interest group too. So if you have an interest in that or in being a co-chair, just reach out to myself or Matthias, and we will take that forward as the next piece of work. So thanks, everyone. Enjoy lunch.